Hello everyone, I believe we are now recording. So welcome back to another exciting week of American History 2. Again, if you're not watching this for American History 2, you are somehow in the wrong place. Now, if you remember from last week, we ended up talking about Reconstruction and some of the political actions taken during Reconstruction, how that affected the politics of the country and the experience of newly freed slaves. Today, we're going to look at the other major half of Reconstruction and focus on the economic policies that came about during Reconstruction, specifically focusing on sharecropping. Now, this date is actually a typo. Please ignore it. So, as always, I'll start things off with the key terms. Remember, I'm going to start off with the key terms every single time from now until the end of the semester. This is where most of your content quiz questions and a lot of your writing assignment topics are going to come from. So please do pay attention to these. Now, before that, obviously, I'm going to go into the upcoming dates that you have for the next few weeks. Keep in mind, your first writing assignment is coming up very soon. It'll be due this Friday, September the 4th at 5 p.m. You should be, if you're viewing this during the week, it should be due this Friday, which most likely you are. Now, if you have any questions about that, I posted more information in the PowerPoints from last week about this writing assignment, and the prompt and the rubric, as always, are going to be in Moodle in the Writing Assignment 1 section. Your first content quiz is also coming up in just a couple of weeks as well. It'll be due September the 11th, which is also a Friday, again at 5 p.m. Finally, your final essay thesis statement is going to be due September the 18th, the week after that, also at 5 p.m. And please also keep in mind, if you've forgotten or haven't checked the syllabus lately, you also have your discussion form or creative response assignments due at the end of every week. These are just the major ones you definitely need to make sure you remember. Now, this may be just repetitive for some of you, but I've still been getting a couple of questions about it. So now that since I've been talking about these assignments here, I want to take just a moment to make sure everyone is still clear on how the course is set up. If you're here and found this video, you probably know how it's set up, but you can't be too careful. So, of course, you guys will click on one of these two sections. I'm just going to click on the first one. Second section, if you're viewing this, yours should look pretty much exactly the same. So you can just follow along here as well. Again, please pardon my poor internet connection. It is going to be a little bit slow today probably, especially because it's Sunday afternoon. Everyone's on the internet apparently. So of course you still have the course announcements or the course introduction stuff. It just shows my syllabus, the office hours information, the citation guides, all that stuff you should be familiar with. It'll be here the whole semester. Your Moodle orientation section is over now. If you completed the introductions discussion form and did the syllabus contract, Moodle orientation is done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Now, just as a quick reminder, as I said last week, all of your writing assignment prompts and rubrics and submission areas are located here along with your debates as well, all in this top section. So for example, when you start working on your writing assignment this week, if you haven't started already, just click on this tab right here. You'll see the prompt right here, the rubric right here, and the submission area right here. You can view this throughout the entire week. You should have no problem accessing it. Please let me know if you do. All the other writing assignments are the same. For example, your midterm essays right here. It's got the prompt, the rubric, the submission area, and the date is out on the side for all these assignments, by the way, so you should be able to keep track of when they're all due. Lastly, just to mention again, I mentioned the final essay thesis statement, but also make sure we're all clear on how that works. You will, as you hopefully have seen on your syllabus, you will have 3 assignments that are going to check your progress on the final essay throughout the semester. The first one is the thesis statement, obviously. All of that information and submission stuff can be found in the final essay section of Moodle. The prompt contains the prompt for the final essay as well as for all the other benchmark assignments. So to figure out more information on what to do for this assignment, all you have to do is check the final essay prompt section. You'll turn in the thesis statement here. When it's time for the bibliography, you'll turn it in here. When it's time for the outline, you'll turn it in here. And when it's time for the final essay, you will turn it in right here. Below that, you'll just have your weekly stuff. This is where I'm going to post the readings, lectures, and weekly assignments for every week. So I'll just go over week 1 again. Your lectures will be here. Your readings will be here. Your discussion forum stuff is right here. And any extra stuff you can use for assignments is also down here as well. So, for example, your third content quiz, like I said, is September 11th. That will be during week 3. It will be posted right here under Learning Activities. So, that's the gist for how this class is going to be set up throughout the entire semester, and that's where you'll be able to find all of these assignments. Please let me know if there are any more questions about that. Now, get a little bit more specific into what we're talking about today. Before that, almost forgot, I want to explain some primary and secondary sources information. This should hopefully help you as well for that upcoming writing assignment. Now, as you hopefully remember from last time, but just as a quick reminder, every single writing assignment you do must have primary and secondary sources. There are no exceptions, every single one. Now, I just want to make sure we all understand the difference between primary and secondary sources so you know what to research or how to do effective research. Now, primary sources. A simple definition for a primary source is just anything that is produced during a specific time period, or at the very least is produced later by someone who did live through the time period being discussed. So, a few examples. A newspaper. If, for example, you found a newspaper clipping of the Pearl Harbor attacks, that would be a primary source because it was made by the news or by the media right after the event happened. Diaries, so if you found George Washington's diary, that's a primary source. Oral interviews also count as primary sources because even though you're interviewing them later, they were still there. So, for example, if you interviewed or found an interview of a Vietnam veteran, that's still a primary source. Artifacts, art, autobiographies, news reports like TV reports, radio reports, that's also primary. Propaganda posters or cartoons, and speeches all count as a primary source. Secondary sources are, of course, a bit different. A secondary source is anything that's made by someone, usually an academic. Those are the sources I would focus on, by the way, that was made about a historical period or a historical person after the fact. So it was made by someone later who's trying to interpret the event. They're not just recording what happened that they saw. Few key examples. Your textbook would definitely count as a secondary source. It has primary sources in it, and I definitely encourage you to take advantage of those. But the textbook itself, if you just cite something from the chapter, that's a secondary source. Academic journal articles, which you should be able to find online in the AB Tech library. Those would also count as a secondary source. Most movies are secondary sources. Your average history book is a secondary source. Biographies are a secondary source, along with most websites and encyclopedias you're going to find. So again, just anything that was produced by someone after the fact. Now, that hopefully should explain the basics of the differences. I'm more than willing to bring this up again or to help you on an individual basis. But do please remember that these have to be on every writing assignment unless I say otherwise, which, hint, hint, I most likely will not say otherwise. By the way, I almost forgot to mention, you might notice that I'm using a different software today. That's because apparently I was informed that my old software I was using wouldn't display the YouTube videos I tried to play, so we're going to try this for today. Ironically, YouTube also seems to be down today, so I can't really play anything on YouTube, so it's almost pointless. But again, please bear with my technology issues, and I'll try to bear with yours as well. In the meantime, let's get into more specific content stuff for today. So, first thing I want to do is to explain some of the context for what brought about the Reconstruction economy we're going to discuss today. Now, just a quick rundown of what the Civil War economy was like before Reconstruction. That economy was almost entirely dependent upon slaves. But again, that's something a lot of people don't recognize today. We think that slavery was just an issue for the South. It actually wasn't. Just as a quick review, think of what you hopefully learned in American History 1. Think of what happened to all the stuff that slaves produced in the South. Where was it sent to? Imaginary audience that actually isn't here right now. Exactly right. As you probably would remember, it was all sent to the northern factories. So everything the factories were producing in the north was being supplied for the most part by slavery in the South. So the entire country depended on it in some form or another. However, the economies were very different on the surface level. Their slavery was, of course, concentrated primarily in the South. The industry and the factories were in the North. Again, as we'll get to in just a second, slavery did make a ton of money as well. So it was a very profitable economy. There are a couple of big problems that the South and the country as a whole had to deal with once the country was over. First off, are labor shortages. Why is there so much of a labor shortage now? There's two big reasons. Imaginary class again. This is my least favorite part, teaching online, the awkward pauses for a class that isn't here. But yes, as you probably would remember, we just got out of the Civil War, of course, so just the massive loss of life. Fun fact that's not so fun for those of you who don't know, there were over 600,000 American casualties in the entirety of the Civil War. That's about 200,000 more than we lost in World War II. So the loss of life for America was horrendous at the time. So there's just less workers in general, and of course also, as we talked about last week, this is right after emancipation. So slaves are no longer wanting to work for their masters, naturally, and they're leaving the plantations. So you have to figure out how to keep the economy going, at least from the perspective of a southern plantation owner. Then, of course, the war devastation is never a great thing either. A lot of infrastructure was destroyed. If you're familiar with William Sherman's infamous March to the Sea, he destroyed quite a few railroads and railroad lines all across the South. So it's going to be a lot of difficulty in transporting goods and producing anything. So that's something else we have to deal with. Now, before we move on, I do want to explain the importance of that thing I just mentioned about slavery making a lot of money. To do that, I'd like to just get this brief quote from a very excellent history book by Edward Baptist called The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. So in his introduction, he writes, if slavery was outside of U.S. history, for instance, if indeed it was a drag and not a rocket booster to American economic growth, then slavery was not implicated in U.S. growth, success, power, and wealth. Therefore, none of the massive quantities of wealth and treasure piled up by the economic growth is owed to African Americans. So, essentially, what is he saying here? Again, awkward pause. By the way, these awkward pauses are to hopefully let you think for yourselves. So it's not just me talking and telling you everything right away. It's very awkward, I know, but imagine what it's like for me. Alright, so essentially what it might sound like he's arguing is he's arguing that if slavery was not beneficial essentially to American economic growth, then essentially we don't owe the success of the American economy to slavery. Now, he's not actually arguing that. He's arguing he's talking about what other people are arguing and looking at their perspective. Because remember, as I just told you, and as you could hopefully have learned in American History 1, slavery did actually make quite a bit of money. However, as he's acknowledging here, many people try to argue that it didn't. Because, again, if slavery wasn't a profitable business, then that means that we don't owe any of the capitalist success that America had later to slavery. Because as you might have heard in your previous history classes, a lot of people try to argue that the American economy wasn't profitable until after slavery was over. However, since it was slavery that was fueling those northern factories, again, that's not really the case. Now, why do you think that's so important to remember? And, just to look at on the flip side, why would so many people try to argue that slavery wasn't a profitable enterprise? Alright, as you could probably tell, I was hinting towards, I basically just said it. A lot of people don't want to acknowledge that we do actually owe slavery for a lot of the economic successes that we had in this country. And, as he sort of mentioned in that last sentence right there, if we don't owe African Americans or slaves and their descendants anything, then we don't owe them access to any of the treasure and wealth or anything that our economy has produced. So essentially, a lot of people try to popularize the idea that slavery made no money, so we can argue against things like reparations and acknowledging the impact of slavery. So again, I believe personally that it is quite important to remember how profitable slavery was. So we do recognize that the economy doesn't owe itself to just being fantastic. It owes a lot of its success to the existence of slavery, and that's something we have to acknowledge and be aware of. I'll talk about that a little more as we go on in class today, and especially more a little bit next week when we talk about the lost cause. In the meantime, let's look at some of these specific plans people had for what the economy is going to be like after the Civil War. The first one is the Northern Plan. The North one is something called a free labor plan, which you can kind of see here with your typical yeoman farmer or yeoman worker out here. This plan was inspired by something called the Free Soil, Free Labor Party, which those of you who like your older American political history might be aware is actually the party that became the Republican Party. Essentially, this party believed that wage labor, or free labor as they called it, was the most superior method of making money and setting up an economy that you could ever have, and it needed to replace slavery because it was a much better economic system than slavery. So on the surface, that sounds very good. They wanted to get rid of slavery. Abraham Lincoln was, like I said, a member of this party. He wanted to get rid of slavery. So it sounds very good. However, you might have noticed that I didn't mention anything about this party advocating for black equality or for any kind of black liberation, or really even abolition to very much. The reason is because they weren't typically concerned with African American equality like some abolitionists were that you hopefully would have, like some of the ones you would have learned about in American History 1. So that is a bit of a problematic ideology, actually. For example, a lot of the Free Soil, Free Labor Party individuals also supported something called the Back to Africa movement. They didn't want African American equality. They wanted to get rid of slavery, get white people into wage labor jobs, and send African Americans back to Africa so they wouldn't compete for those jobs. So they still didn't want black people to compete for their jobs. They just wanted to get slavery out of the way so their wage labor workers could take all the jobs. So again, it's better than being a full-out supporter for slavery, arguably, but it's still not a perfect system. Also, another big part of their plan that's worth mentioning that I'm going to talk about a little bit today as well is their dedication to trying to repair the devastation in the South. Why would they bother with this? Why help repair the damages of your enemy? Again, awkward pauses. Alright, as you hopefully remember from last time, one of the policies of the Compromise of 1877 was that the North would help repair the South and industrialize it in return for leaving the South alone and not bothering the South anymore, essentially. I could have worded that better. My apologies. But again, that was one of the promises for helping out the South and for getting them to allow the Northern president, Rutherford B. Hayes, to become president. Also, you can't really trade and get access to resources in the South or trade with the South if you don't have some kind of infrastructure and specifically railroads to access the South. So again, it helps to appease the South while also making money from the South. The freed slaves also had some plans as well, as you might well imagine. A lot of these plans center around the 40 acres and a mule ideology, which some of you are probably familiar with. Anybody know where that came from? Imaginary classroom audience. Alright, it's actually, the phrase originally comes from actually Sherman Sherman and his troops giving this idea to freed slaves in Texas, that every freed slave that supported the Union would get their own 40 acres of land and have access to their own mule. Why would this maybe be so important to slaves? Think about what their condition was like under slavery. Alright, again, as you probably could guess, owning property is really the key part of this. Under slavery, of course, slaves were considered property, so they owned absolutely no property, except in extremely rare instances. So it was very important to them now to be able to own property so they could have their own economic independence instead of having to depend entirely upon their masters. They were also, as I mentioned a little bit last time, passionately argued for land redistribution as well. First off, anyone know what land redistribution actually is? Alright, land redistribution typically is where you take land from wealthy landowners or very wealthy people and redistribute it to the poorer classes. This again would be very important for former slaves because it gives them again that economic independence. They can own their own land instead of having to work for someone else's land and give them all the profit. Also, land redistribution was particularly attractive to slaves because of all those years they spent working on people's land and getting no profit. A lot of slaves argued that they deserved access to at least some of their master's former land as reparations or repayment for working that land for so many years. So this is another big part of what free slaves were after. So again, this was all essentially about controlling their own labor rights. Because again, under slavery, their labor was totally controlled and none of it really profited them. This whole idea was that they would own their own property, so they would get the wealth produced by their own labor now. And for a while, it seemed like this actually could be a possibility. there were actually quite a few successes and opportunities after the Civil War was over. For example, before the Black Codes especially, which we talked about last week, some African Americans actually did get the opportunity to rent land or buy land and now had the ability to leave their fields whenever they wanted. So instead of having someone whip you or abuse you if you tried to leave the field, you could come and go when you were working at your leisure. Labor shortage actually also provided an opportunity. So it was, on a certain hand, a problem because you didn't have access to as many workers, but why would that create an opportunity for other workers? Any economic fans or economic historians out there potentially? Alright, if there are, you're probably exactly right. It's the classic supply and demand scenario. If you have less of a supply of labor, that means you're going to have more of a demand to get access to labor, so it gives other people better paying jobs and better opportunities, including in many cases former slaves. So for a while, the labor shortage helped them. The politics of protection tariffs were a bit more complicated, but many also saw these as an economic opportunity. Does anybody listening, any of my economic fans again, know what a tariff is? Alright, very good, imaginary class. A tariff is, of course, an tax that you place on imports. So it essentially costs more money to import things. Specifically, we were focusing on taxing European imports. The North, of course, as you can imagine, loved this because they had the factories that produced goods. So now they get to sell more of their goods across the country because people aren't buying it from Europe instead. Why would the South and the North not like this as much? Right, it's essentially what I just mentioned earlier. Remember, most of the factories were in the North. The South were the ones producing the raw materials. So instead of being able to buy stuff from Europe cheaply or sell stuff to Europe cheaply or for a higher profit, the North and the South had to rely pretty much entirely upon the North for all of this. So again, it's sort of they saw it as an unequal economic relationship. The Morrill Land Grant also was very beneficial for secondary education particularly. Many colleges during this time period were actually built on federal land sales. So this grant would take money the federal government sold and build colleges on it. So for example, the University of Maryland, Michigan State, Cornell, and Kansas State are all land grant colleges that were built by this Morrill Land Grant. The national banking system was also beneficial by restoring a uniform currency across the country, because remember, the South had been using Confederate dollars during the duration of the war. So why would a uniform currency help bring the country back together? Alright, yeah, that one's very simple. I notice my pauses are getting shorter. I can't handle the awkwardness. But yeah, again, the uniform currency is beneficial because you can now buy and sell across the country again. Because if you don't have different currencies, it obviously makes that much more complicated. But when you all use the same money, you can buy and sell things with no problem. Also, we have the Transcontinental Railroad, which you can see pictured here, which was finished in 1869. The reason I call it the first Amazon is now, for the first time, you could do something that would eventually lead into what we know as Amazon today. So, for example, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Amazon and how you can just type in a few buttons and get almost anything you could possibly imagine delivered right to your front doorstep. The Transcontinental Railroad was one of the first times in American history people could actually do something close to that. With this Continental Railroad, specifically connecting the country essentially, people could now order things through a catalog from very far away, and the Transcontinental Railroad would eventually bring it to them. It was much slower than even Amazon is today, but still, for the first time, you could now order things all across the country. It became much easier to trade at very long distances. So again, it looks like the country is getting united together for the most part, and that more people are having access to education and to they're controlling their own labor, all sorts of very fantastic things. However, ultimately, this didn't last very long because, for the most part, again, former slaves were not actually able to achieve quick economic independence. Why would that probably be the case? All right, yeah, the black codes that we talked about last week were one of the biggest examples. There were still laws being put into place, especially once Reconstruction started to wind down and the North lost its influence, that kept African Americans from working, would force them into labor if they tried to loiter, could steal their guns, all sorts of crazy things. So the result of that is probably an infamous economic system that you've probably heard of, sharecropping. Sharecropping is essentially the economic system that defines the South and most of the country for many decades after the Civil War. Sharecropping is a system where poor farmers, many in most cases freed African Americans, but some poor white farmers as well, who would work on someone else's land in exchange for a portion of the produce. Usually you would get about 1/3 or 1/2 of the crops that were supplied. Produced. You would give half of the crops or 2/3 of the crops to your landowner who would sell it for a profit. You got to keep some of it that you could sell on your own or just use it to survive. Now, on the surface, this may not sound like the most terrible system in the world, but the reason it was so exploitative and why it's been called the new slavery often is because of something called the crop lien system. The crop lien system was essentially the only way that these sharecroppers had access to any tools or any supplies they needed, because again, they were getting paid in crops for the most part. They weren't getting paid directly in money. What you would do is you would go to a merchant and buy supplies on credit. Credit, if you don't know, is when you obtain goods without payment, but you have a promise to pay in the future for it. So, for example, if you have a credit card now and you buy something with a credit card, you don't pay for it right away. You just have to pay your credit card bill at the end of the month. That's how the crop lien system worked. Now, former slaves didn't really have a choice but to get involved in sharecropping for the most part for a few key reasons. One, as we talked about last week, when Andrew Johnson was president, he was very passionate against land redistribution, so he didn't want to redistribute any land to slaves. Night riders were also a big deal, which we'll talk about even more over the next coming of weeks. These vigilante groups were extremely common after the Civil War. What they would do is they would ride around and attack, again, loiterers. These black codes and these groups typically focus on loiterers, or just any independent-looking African American, and to harass them until they were agreed to go into some sort of sharecropping system or work for someone in some capacity. And again, like I mentioned, the black codes. Black codes essentially assured that black Americans didn't really have any protection from the law and had no access to their own labor, so this was really their only option. Now, to explain the crop lien system in more detail, why it was so exploitative, I have this little system right here. Like I said, they weren't really paid in money. The only money they got was from their crop sales, so they had to buy things on credit. As you might imagine, the reason this was so horrible for them is because they would be charged extremely high interest rates. For those of you who don't know, and hopefully none of you do know, I'm hoping none of my students are in credit card debt yet, but if, God forbid, any of you have to deal with student loans, you might learn a little bit about this the hard way. When you pay that credit card bill at the end of the month, if you don't pay it on time, your interest payments can go up, and you end up having to pay even more than you originally promised to spend. Landowners for sharecroppers typically charge very high interest rates as well. They would also be given unfavorable contracts, which again, since they have nowhere else to work, there's nothing they can really do about it. And also, as you can imagine, there is a lot of times the merchants which have very high prices as well, ensuring you had to borrow quite a bit of credit just to pay it off. So essentially, it's very simple. The sharecroppers would be short of cash, especially if there was a bad harvest. They had to use credit to buy things to survive. Their balances are going to grow, but of course they get higher payments. If the harvests again are still bad, they get the same income, so they have to pay their bills, and now they're short on cash again. So the key is these high interest payments again. You can't really get out of this cycle when your interest keeps going up. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the African American experience after the Civil War in a week or so. In the meantime, I did want to mention a little bit what other groups are going through at the same time. So, for example, then all of these were caused by negative impacts of the Transcontinental Railroad. For example, Native Americans in particular were impacted by this railroad, as we'll talk even more about next week, because it justified stealing lands in the West. since you have, again, this railroad that now crosses all the way from Iowa to San Francisco, this railroad stretching all the way out from basically the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Because of that, people were very tempted to try to go in and take Native American lands because it was much easier to get there now. This helped justify the Manifest Destiny argument, which we'll talk more about next week. Second, you've got the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which is one of the most racist immigration laws we've ever produced in our nation's history. The specific goals of this law were to limit Asian immigration to the country, specifically, of course, focusing on China, as you can guess from the title. This law was justified because it was believed that the Chinese were stealing jobs to produce the Transcontinental Railroad. So ironically, you're punishing the workers who made this thing possible in the first place. This law, just to give you an idea of how long this law lasted, it was repealed in 1943, repealed by allowing just 105 Chinese and Asian immigrants to enter per year. The law wouldn't be fully repealed until the Immigration Act of 1965, which established the national origins quota, getting rid of a lot of these limitations on certain nations' immigrants. Now you can see a little bit more of the sentiments of this idea as well. You can see Chinese people, of course, depicted in very racist ways. The Chinese must go, being chased out, as you can see here. So again, the Chinese were because of their involvement in building this railroad, Chinese immigrants became very unpopular during this time. And these attitudes have not changed, as you can see here, for a very, very long time. Now, like I said, YouTube is not working for me today for some reason, so I'm not going to play this now, but I am going to ask you to view this Chinese Exclusion Act video on your own time. It's very short, but it does go into a bit more specific detail about how exactly the Chinese Exclusion Act worked and the numbers of people that it barred from entering the country. Lastly, I just want to end this on sort of a reflective note on the hypocrisy of some of these anti-immigrant stances. What I'd like to do is give you a minute or so to look at this cartoon, and I want you to sort of discuss what point it's trying to get across. So again, awkward silence, my apologies. Alright, as you can probably see here, the straightforward message of what's happening is you have an immigrant coming in here on the right, trying to come into the country, and he's being held back by these rich-looking guys. However, look at the shadows behind them. What exactly do you think those are? Alright, as you might be able to guess, this actually represents their ancestors, who you can see look like your typical immigrant. That is a big reason why historians argue these acts are so hypocritical. A lot of them are being passed and supported by individuals who also had immigrant ancestors in the past who gave them the opportunity to be in the country in the first place. So again, extremely hypocritical, I believe, for all these acts to be passed. Now, in the meantime, that's all I have for you for the Reconstruction economy. Just again, remember, your writing assignment 1's coming up this Friday. Next Friday, you have your first content quiz, and the Friday after that, you have your final essay thesis statements. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know as soon as possible. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week, and I will see you again at some point whenever you view my recording on The Lost Cause. Adios.